The night was thick with silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves outside the sprawling mansion on the outskirts of Boston, Massachusetts. The estate belonged to Richard Langston, a reclusive millionaire known for his eccentricities and a fortune amassed through shrewd investments in technology. At 62, Langston had everything money could buy: luxury cars, priceless art, and a reputation that teetered between admiration and suspicion. Yet, it was his basement that drew the most intrigue, a place whispered about in hushed tones among the staff and neighbors. Langston's mansion was an architectural marvel, but it was the basement, sealed behind a steel-reinforced door, that sparked endless rumors. Some said it housed treasures from around the world. Others believed it concealed secrets darker than anyone dared to imagine. Langston himself had never confirmed nor denied these speculations, his cryptic smile serving as the only answer to prying questions. The story begins on a stormy Friday evening. Thunder growled in the distance as Detective Eleanor Hart received an urgent call from her precinct. A body had been discovered at Langston's estate, none other than Richard Langston himself. The details were sparse. He had been found dead, next to what appeared to be a hidden vault in his infamous basement. Eleanor was no stranger to high-profile cases, but this one felt different. As she drove through the rain-slicked streets toward the mansion, her mind raced with questions. What could have killed a man like Langston? And why had he been in his basement so late at night? When she arrived at the scene, the mansion loomed, like a ghostly silhouette against the stormy sky. Police cars were parked haphazardly along the circular driveway, their lights casting eerie red and blue flashes across the manicured lawn. Eleanor stepped out of her car, pulling her trench coat tighter against the biting wind. Inside, the air was heavy with tension. The foyer was grand yet cold, its marble floors gleaming under crystal chandeliers. A butler stood near the staircase, his face pale and drawn as he answered questions from another officer. Eleanor's gaze shifted to the doorway leading to the basement, a yawning black hole that seemed to beckon her forward. Descending into the basement felt like entering another world. The air grew colder with each step, and an unsettling stillness enveloped her. The room at the bottom was cavernous, lined with shelves of books and artifacts that hinted at Langston's eclectic tastes, but it was the far corner of the room that drew everyone's attention. A massive steel vault embedded in the wall, its door slightly ajar. Langston's body lay crumpled on the floor next to it, his lifeless eyes staring at something unseen. His hand clutched a small brass key smeared with blood, a detail that sent a shiver down Eleanor's spine. The vault itself was empty, save for a single object resting inside, an old leather-bound journal with no visible markings on its cover. The medical examiner crouched beside Langston's body, her expression grim as she glanced up at Eleanor. "No signs of forced entry," she said quietly, "and no visible wounds either." Eleanor frowned, kneeling next to Langston's body for a closer look. His face was frozen in an expression of terror, as though he had seen something, or someone, that defied explanation. She reached for the journal inside the vault, but hesitated when her fingers brushed against its surface. It felt unnaturally cold, almost as if it were alive. "What is this place?" she murmured to herself, her voice barely audible over the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. The butler appeared at the top of the stairs then, his voice trembling as he called down to Eleanor. "Detective, there's something you should know." She turned to face him, her heart pounding in anticipation of what he might reveal. "What is it?" "The vault," he said hesitantly, "wasn't just for valuables." He paused before adding in a whisper that sent chills down Eleanor's spine. "Mr. Langston believed it could trap things that didn't belong in this world." Eleanor stared at him for a long moment before turning back to Langston's lifeless form and the ominous journal inside the vault. Whatever secrets this basement held, they were far more sinister than she had imagined, and they were only just beginning to unravel. Eleanor Hart stood frozen in the dimly lit basement, the butler's words echoing in her mind. Mr. Langston believed it could trap things that didn't belong in this world. She turned back to the vault, its gaping mouth like a silent taunt. The journal inside seemed to radiate an unnatural energy, as if daring her to open it. After a moment of hesitation, she slipped on a pair of gloves and carefully retrieved the book. The leather cover was aged and cracked, its surface etched with faint symbols that looked ancient and indecipherable. Eleanor flipped it open, revealing pages filled with intricate sketches and hurried handwriting. The first few entries were mundane, notes about Langston's investments and personal musings. But as she turned the pages, the tone shifted. Langston had written about experiments conducted in his basement. He spoke of dimensional anomalies, strange occurrences that began after he acquired certain artifacts from his travels. One entry stood out. The vault is not just a safe, it is a barrier. It keeps them out, or keeps them in. Eleanor's stomach twisted as she read further. Langston described hearing whispers in the dead of night, voices that seemed to emanate from the vault itself. He wrote about shadows moving where there shouldn't have been any, objects disappearing only to reappear in impossible places. The final entry was scrawled with such urgency that the ink had bled through the page. If you are reading this, it means I failed. Do not open the vault again. A chill ran down Eleanor's spine as she looked at Langston's lifeless body sprawled on the floor. Had he opened the vault one last time? And if so, what had come out? "Detective Hart!" a voice called from behind her, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was Officer Daniels, one of her most trusted colleagues. He descended the stairs cautiously, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. "We found something. Upstairs, you need to see." Eleanor followed him back up to Langston's study, where a team of officers had gathered around a shattered display case. Inside had been an artifact, a jagged black stone encased in glass, but now only shards remained. The butler stood nearby, wringing his hands nervously. "What was kept here?" Eleanor asked, her tone sharp. The butler hesitated before answering. "It was an obsidian shard," he said finally, his voice trembling. "Mr. Langston claimed it was cursed." "Cursed?" Daniel scoffed, but Eleanor wasn't so quick to dismiss the idea. She had seen enough strange cases in her career to know that some things defied logic and reason. "Where is it now?" she pressed, scanning the room for any sign of the missing artifact. The butler shook his head helplessly. "I don't know," he admitted. "It disappeared the same night Mr. Langston died." Eleanor felt a knot form in her chest as she pieced together what little information they had. Langston had been obsessed with containing something within his vault. He had died under mysterious circumstances, and now a supposedly cursed artifact was missing from his collection. The connections were tenuous but undeniable, and deeply unsettling. As night fell over Boston, Eleanor returned to her apartment with Langston's journal tucked under her arm. She spent hours poring over its contents, trying to make sense of the cryptic entries and bizarre sketches. One drawing in particular caught her attention. A figure cloaked in shadow with elongated limbs and glowing eyes that seemed to burn through the page itself. Beneath it, Langston had written only one word: Watcher. The next day brought more questions than answers. The autopsy report revealed no clear cause of death for Langston, no signs of trauma or poisoning, no underlying medical conditions that could explain his sudden demise. It was as if his life had simply stopped. Meanwhile, strange reports began trickling in from around the neighborhood. Pets going missing without a trace, lights flickering inexplicably, neighbors claiming to hear faint whispers when no one else was around. Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that whatever Langston had been trying to contain in his basement was now loose, and growing stronger by the hour. Her investigation led her to Dr. Margaret Voss, an expert in ancient artifacts who had worked with Langston in the past. When Eleanor showed her a photograph of the obsidian shard from Langston's study, Dr. Voss paled visibly. "That's no ordinary stone," she said gravely. "It's said to be a fragment of something far older than humanity itself, a relic from another plane of existence." She hesitated before adding in a whisper, "If it's been released, we're all in danger." Eleanor felt a surge of urgency as Dr. Voss explained that such artifacts were believed to act as conduits between worlds, gateways through which entities could pass into our reality if left unchecked. But there was one glimmer of hope. According to legend, these entities could be banished if their connection to our world was severed completely, though doing so required immense courage and precision. As Eleanor left Dr. Voss's office that evening, clutching notes on how to potentially close whatever gateway Langston had opened, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The shadows seemed darker than usual. Every creak of a floorboard or rustle of leaves set her nerves on edge. Whatever had escaped from Langston's vault wasn't just lurking, it was hunting. Eleanor Hart had always been a solitary figure, a detective who preferred the company of her thoughts to the chaos of human interaction. But as the days passed and the mystery surrounding Richard Langston's death deepened, she found herself drawn into a web of relationships that tested her resolve and forced her to confront the limits of her own understanding. The first was with Officer Daniels, her steadfast partner in countless investigations. Daniels was pragmatic to a fault, a man who believed in evidence and logic above all else. But even he couldn't deny the strangeness of what they were dealing with. As they reviewed the case together late one evening in the precinct, Daniels leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowed. "This whole thing feels wrong," he admitted, breaking the silence. "I mean, no cause of death? A missing artifact? And that journal?" He shook his head. "It's like something out of a horror movie." Eleanor didn't respond immediately. She was staring at a photograph of Langston's vault, her mind racing with possibilities. "What if it's not just a story?" she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniels gave her a skeptical look, but didn't argue. He had seen enough over the years to know that sometimes the truth was stranger than fiction. Still, his skepticism was a constant undercurrent in their conversations, a reminder of how tenuous their grip on reality had become. Then there was Dr. Margaret Voss, whose expertise in ancient artifacts had become an invaluable resource for Eleanor. The two women met again at Dr. Voss's cluttered office, surrounded by shelves of dusty tomes and peculiar relics from around the world. "You need to understand," Dr. Voss said urgently as she handed Eleanor an old manuscript filled with arcane symbols. "This isn't just about Langston or his vault. If that shard is truly what I think it is, then we're dealing with forces far beyond our comprehension." Eleanor studied the manuscript, her pulse quickening as she recognized some of the symbols from Langston's journal. "How do we stop it?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her insides. Dr. Voss hesitated before answering. "You'll need to find where it's anchored itself," she said finally. "These entities, they don't just roam freely. They latch onto places, or people, that give them power." She paused, meeting Eleanor's gaze with an intensity that sent chills down her spine. "But be warned, confronting it will come at a cost." Eleanor left their meeting feeling both empowered and terrified. The idea that something otherworldly could be feeding off their reality was almost too much to bear. But she knew she couldn't back down now. Her interactions with Langston's staff added another layer to the mystery, and to her growing unease. The butler, Mr. Grayson, seemed genuinely distraught over his employer's death, but grew evasive whenever Eleanor pressed him about the vault or the artifact. One evening, as she questioned him in Langston's study, he finally broke down. "I told him not to meddle with those things," Grayson said, his voice trembling as he wrung his hands nervously. "But he wouldn't listen. He said he had to understand, to control it." He looked up at Eleanor with haunted eyes. "And now, look what's happened." "What did he think he was controlling?" Eleanor asked gently. Grayson hesitated before answering. "He called it the Watcher," he whispered, echoing the name from Langston's journal. Eleanor felt a shiver run down her spine at the mention of that name again. But before she could press further, Grayson abruptly excused himself and left the room. As days turned into nights and nights into sleepless hours filled with research and dread, Eleanor found herself grappling not only with the case but also with her own sense of isolation. She had always prided herself on being self-reliant, but now more than ever, she realized how much she needed others. Daniels became her anchor in moments when fear threatened to overwhelm her, a steady presence who reminded her that no matter how dark things got, she wasn't alone. Dr. Voss offered guidance and wisdom that helped Eleanor navigate the labyrinthine complexities of Langston's journals and manuscripts. And even Grayson, despite his evasiveness, provided glimpses into Langston's life that helped piece together the puzzle of what had happened in that basement. But these relationships were not without their strains. Daniels grew increasingly frustrated by Eleanor's willingness to entertain theories that defied logic, and by her insistence on pursuing leads that seemed more like superstition than solid evidence. Dr. Voss warned Eleanor repeatedly about getting too close to whatever force they were dealing with, reminding her that curiosity could be as dangerous as ignorance when it came to such matters. And Grayson? Well, Grayson seemed to be hiding. Something that made Eleanor question whether he was truly an ally or another piece of this dark puzzle. Through it all, one thing became clear. Whatever had escaped from Langston's vault wasn't just a threat to their investigation. It was a threat to everyone involved. And as strange occurrences continued to escalate, shadows moving where they shouldn't, whispers echoing through empty rooms, an overwhelming sense of being watched, Eleanor realized that time was running out. The Watcher wasn't just lurking in the shadows anymore. It was coming for them all. The storm rolled in without warning, a violent symphony of thunder and lightning that rattled the windows of Eleanor's apartment as she stared at the journal spread open on her desk. The symbols etched into its pages seemed to shift under the flickering light of her desk lamp, as though alive. She had spent days deciphering Langston's cryptic notes, piecing together fragments of a story that defied belief. But now, as the storm raged outside, she felt the weight of inevitability pressing down on her. The turning point came that night. Eleanor had been running on adrenaline and caffeine for days, her mind consumed by the mystery of Langston's vault and the entity he had called the Watcher. But as she read and reread his final entries, a pattern began to emerge. Coordinates scrawled in the margins, references to an abandoned property on the outskirts of Boston. It was a place Langston had purchased years ago but never developed. A plot of land surrounded by dense woods and shrouded in secrecy. Her phone buzzed on the desk, jolting her from her thoughts. It was Daniel's. "You're not going to believe this," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "We've got another body." Eleanor's heart sank. "Where?" "2 blocks from Langston's mansion," Daniels replied grimly. "Same look. No wounds, no cause of death. Just gone." She didn't need to hear more. Grabbing her coat and Langston's journal, she raced out into the storm, the rain lashing against her windshield as she drove toward the scene. The streets were eerily empty, the city seemingly holding its breath in anticipation of something terrible. When she arrived, Daniels was waiting for her near an alley cordoned off with police tape. The victim was a young woman, her face frozen in an expression of sheer terror that mirrored Langston's own. Nearby, officers whispered among themselves, their usual bravado replaced by unease. "This is getting out of hand," Daniels muttered, as Eleanor crouched beside the body, examining it closely. "Whatever's going on here, it's not normal." Eleanor didn't respond immediately. Her eyes were drawn to something clutched in the victim's hand, a scrap of paper with a symbol that matched one from Langston's journal, a jagged circle enclosing an eye-like shape. She slipped it into an evidence bag before standing up, her mind racing. "This isn't random," she said finally, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her insides. "It's connected to Langston, and to whatever he was trying to keep locked away." Daniels frowned but didn't argue. He had seen enough strange things over the past week to know better than to dismiss Eleanor's instincts. "So what do we do?" he asked quietly. Eleanor hesitated for only a moment before answering. "We go to where it all started." The drive to Langston's abandoned property felt like stepping into another world. The city lights faded behind them as they entered a stretch of dense forest, the road narrowing until it was barely more than a dirt path winding through the trees. Rain pounded against the car roof as Eleanor and Daniels exchanged uneasy glances, neither willing to voice their growing sense of dread. When they finally arrived at the property, it was clear why Langston had chosen this place for his experiments, or his hiding place. The land was isolated and overgrown, with no sign of human activity for years. At its center stood a crumbling stone structure that looked more like an ancient ruin than anything built in modern times. "This is it," Eleanor said softly, as they stepped out into the rain, flashlights cutting through the darkness. Inside the structure, they found what could only be described as a ritual site, a circle etched into the stone floor surrounded by strange markings that matched those in Langston's journal. At its center lay another obsidian shard, larger than the one missing from Langston's study, but identical in its jagged shape and ominous aura. Eleanor felt her pulse quicken as she approached it cautiously, every instinct screaming at her to turn back, but she couldn't stop now. "This is where he anchored it," she murmured, more to herself than to Daniels. Anchored what? Daniels asked nervously. The Watcher, Eleanor replied grimly. Before Daniels could respond, a low hum filled the air, a sound that seemed to vibrate through their very bones. The shard began to glow faintly, its surface pulsing with an unnatural light that cast eerie shadows across the room. And then they saw it. A figure emerged from the darkness beyond the circle, a towering silhouette cloaked in shadow with glowing eyes that burned like embers. It moved with an unnatural grace, its elongated limbs bending in ways that defied logic or anatomy. Daniel swore under his breath, raising his weapon instinctively, but Eleanor grabbed his arm before he could fire. Don't, she said urgently. It won't help. The Watcher stepped closer, its gaze fixed on Eleanor as if recognizing her from some distant memory, or perhaps sensing her connection to Langston through his journal. Eleanor forced herself to stand her ground despite every fiber of her being screaming at her to run. She reached into her bag and pulled out Langston's notes, along with Dr. Voss's translations. We have to sever its connection, she said, quickly, flipping through pages until she found what she was looking for. Instructions for completing a ritual that could banish entities like this back to wherever they came from. Daniels looked at her like she was insane but didn't argue. He trusted her judgment even when everything about this situation screamed otherwise. As Eleanor began reciting words from Langston's notes, words that felt foreign and heavy on her tongue, the Watcher let out a guttural sound that shook the very walls around them. The air grew colder, shadows danced wildly, and for one terrifying moment, Eleanor thought they might fail. But then something shifted. The shard shattered into pieces with a deafening crack, and just like that, the Watcher was gone. Eleanor collapsed onto her knees as silence fell over the room once more. But deep down, she knew this wasn't over yet. Eleanor sat on the cold stone floor of the ruin, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The Watcher was gone, banished, or so it seemed, but the oppressive weight of its presence lingered like a shadow over her chest. Daniels knelt beside her, his face pale and his hands trembling. The shattered obsidian shard lay scattered across the ritual circle, its pieces dull and lifeless now, as if whatever power it had once held had been extinguished. You did it, Daniels said, his voice hoarse with disbelief. You actually did it. Eleanor shook her head, staring at the fragments. I don't think it's that simple, she murmured. This wasn't just about the Watcher. Langston was trying to contain something much bigger than we realized. Daniels frowned but didn't press her further. He didn't need to. He could see the doubt etched into every line of her face. The drive back to Boston was silent, both of them lost in their thoughts. Eleanor replayed the events of the night over and over in her mind, searching for clues she might have missed, for answers that still eluded her. The ritual had worked, for now, but the journal had hinted at something far worse lurking behind the veil of their reality. Langston's experiments had opened a door, and Eleanor wasn't sure they had managed to close it completely. The next morning brought no relief. Eleanor returned to Langston's mansion to comb through his belongings once more, determined to find anything that might explain what they were truly up against. The basement felt different now, emptier, quieter, but not in a way that comforted her. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. She spent hours sifting through papers and artifacts, piecing together fragments of Langston's life that painted a picture of a man consumed by obsession. He had been searching for answers to questions most people wouldn't dare to ask. What lies beyond our world? What forces govern the unseen? And most importantly, how can they be controlled? It became clear that Langston hadn't just stumbled upon the Watcher by accident. He had summoned it deliberately, believing he could harness its power for his own purposes. But somewhere along the way, he had realized his mistake. The vault hadn't been built to protect his treasures. It had been built to contain his failure. As Eleanor delved deeper into Langston's notes, she began to see parallels between his journey and her own. Like him, she had been drawn into a mystery that defied logic and reason. A mystery that demanded sacrifices she wasn't sure she was willing to make. Her conversations with Dr. Voss became more frequent and more urgent as they worked together to decipher the remaining symbols in Langston's journal. Voss warned Eleanor repeatedly about the dangers of digging too deep, but Eleanor couldn't stop herself. She needed to understand what Langston had unleashed, and what it would take to stop it for good. Meanwhile, Daniels grew increasingly concerned about Eleanor's state of mind. She was pushing herself harder than ever, barely sleeping or eating, as she threw herself into the investigation with relentless determination. "You're going to burn out," he told her one evening as they sat in her apartment, surrounded by stacks of papers and books. "I don't have a choice," she replied without looking up from Langston's journal. "If I don't figure this out, more people are going to die." Daniels sighed but didn't argue. He knew better than anyone how stubborn Eleanor could be when she set her mind to something. But even he couldn't ignore the toll this case was taking on her, or on himself. The turning point came when another body was discovered, this time in broad daylight at a crowded park in downtown Boston. The victim was an elderly man who had no apparent connection to Langston or his estate, but like the others, he bore no signs of trauma or illness. Eleanor arrived at the scene with Daniels by her side, her heart sinking as she examined the body. This wasn't random. It couldn't be. The Watcher might have been banished from their world, but its influence remained. That night, Eleanor sat alone in her apartment with Langston's journal open on her desk and a glass of whiskey in her hand. She stared at the pages until the words blurred together, exhaustion threatening to overwhelm her. And then she saw it. A symbol hidden in the margins of one of Langston's sketches that she hadn't noticed before. It wasn't just a symbol. It was a map. The realization hit her like a lightning bolt. Langston hadn't just been trying to contain the Watcher. He had been trying to find its source. Eleanor felt a surge of determination as she grabbed her coat and headed out into the night once more. She didn't know where this journey would lead, or what sacrifices it would demand. But one thing was certain. She wasn't going to stop until she uncovered the truth. Even if it meant facing whatever lay beyond that door. The night was unnaturally still as Eleanor Hart stepped out of her car, the beam of her flashlight cutting through the oppressive darkness. She had followed the map from Langston's journal to a remote location deep in the forests outside Boston. The air smelled of damp earth and decay, and the trees seemed to close in around her, their skeletal branches clawing at the sky. This was the place Langston had marked, the source of everything. Whatever he had been trying to contain had started here. Daniels had insisted on coming with her, despite her protests. "You're not doing this alone," he had said firmly, his jaw set with determination. Now, as they stood together at the edge of a clearing, Eleanor was grateful for his presence. The weight of what they were about to face was almost too much to bear alone. In the center of the clearing stood a structure that defied explanation. It wasn't quite a building, nor was it entirely natural. Massive stones jutted out of the ground in a circular formation, their surfaces etched with symbols that glowed faintly in the moonlight. The air around them seemed to hum with energy, a low vibration that resonated in Eleanor's chest. "This is it," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the sound of her own heartbeat. Daniels glanced at her, his hand resting on the grip of his gun. "What exactly are we looking for?" Eleanor hesitated before answering. "I don't know," she admitted. "But whatever it is, it's been waiting for us." They stepped into the circle cautiously, their footsteps muffled by the soft moss that covered the ground. As they moved closer to the center, Eleanor felt an overwhelming sense of unease, like they were being watched by something unseen. At the heart of the circle lay another shard of obsidian, larger than any they had encountered before. Its surface pulsed with an eerie light, casting shifting shadows across the stones around them. Eleanor knelt beside it, her gloved hand hovering over its jagged surface. "This is it," she murmured, more to herself than to Daniels. "This is what Langston was trying to contain." Before Daniels could respond, a low rumble shook the ground beneath their feet. The symbols on the stones flared brighter, their glow intensifying until it was almost blinding. Eleanor staggered back as a deafening roar filled the air, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. And then it appeared, the Watcher. It emerged from the shadows like a living nightmare, its towering form cloaked in darkness, and its glowing eyes burning with an otherworldly light. It moved with an unnatural grace, its elongated limbs bending and twisting in ways that defied logic or anatomy. Daniels raised his gun instinctively and fired, but the bullets passed through the creature as if it were made of smoke. The Watcher turned its gaze toward him, and Daniels froze, his body rigid as though paralyzed by its presence. "Daniels!" Eleanor shouted, but he didn't respond. The Watcher's attention shifted to her then, and she felt its gaze pierce through her. Like a blade, it wasn't just looking at her. It was inside her mind, rifling through her thoughts and memories, as if searching for something. Eleanor clenched her fists, forcing herself to stand her ground, despite every instinct screaming at her to run. "You won't win," she said through gritted teeth. "I know what you are." The Watcher tilted its head as if amused by her defiance. Eleanor reached into her bag and pulled out Langston's journal along with Dr. Voss's notes on banishment rituals. She began reciting the incantation aloud, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. The Watcher let out another guttural roar that shook the ground and sent cracks spiderwebbing across the stones around them. But Eleanor didn't stop. The symbols on the stones began to glow brighter in response to her words, their light forming a barrier that seemed to push back against the Watcher's presence. Daniels collapsed to his knees as whatever hold the creature had over him broke. "Keep going!" he shouted hoarsely. Eleanor's voice grew louder as she poured every ounce of strength into the ritual. The Watcher thrashed against the barrier, forming around it, its movements growing more frantic as if sensing its time was running out. Finally, with one last word spoken from Langston's notes, a word that seemed to reverberate through time and space itself, the shard at the center of the circle shattered into countless pieces. The Watcher let out an ear-piercing scream as its form dissolved into smoke and light before vanishing completely. Silence fell over the clearing once more. Eleanor sank to her knees, exhausted but alive. Daniels crawled over to her side, his face pale but determined. "Is it gone?" he asked hesitantly. Eleanor nodded slowly but didn't speak right away. She knew they had succeeded in banishing this manifestation of the Watcher, but deep down, she also knew this wasn't truly over. Langston's experiments had opened a door between worlds, a door that could never fully be closed again. They left the clearing behind and returned to their car under a sky streaked with dawn's first light. Eleanor couldn't shake one final thought. Some doors should never be opened, but once they are, you can never truly escape what lies beyond them. The morning sky was painted in muted shades of gray as Eleanor and Daniels drove back to Boston. The forest seemed to retreat behind them, its oppressive presence fading with each passing mile. But Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed them, that the Watcher, or whatever malevolent force Langston had unleashed, wasn't truly gone. Daniels sat in silence beside her, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. He hadn't said much since they left the clearing, and Eleanor didn't press him. She could see the strain in his eyes, the weight of what they had witnessed pressing down on him like a physical burden. When they finally reached the city, the world felt strangely normal. People going about their lives, oblivious to the horrors that had unfolded just hours earlier. But for Eleanor, normalcy was an illusion. She couldn't stop replaying the events in her mind, the Watcher's glowing eyes, the way it had seemed to know her, and the overwhelming sense that their victory had been temporary at best. Back at her apartment, she collapsed onto her couch, Langston's journal still clutched in her hands. She flipped through its pages again, searching for anything she might have missed, some clue that could explain what had happened and what might come next. And then she saw it. A page she hadn't noticed before, tucked between two others as if it had been deliberately hidden. The handwriting was different, sharper, more frantic, and the words sent a chill down her spine. The Watcher is only a fragment of something greater. If it has reached you, then you are already marked. The door cannot be closed completely. It can only be delayed. And those who stand against it will always pay a price. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as she read the final line. It will return. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, jolting her out of her thoughts. It was Daniels. "We've got a problem," he said without preamble. Another body just turned up. Eleanor's stomach dropped. "Where?" "Downtown," Daniels replied grimly. "Same as before. No wounds, no cause of death. But this time, there was a message." "What kind of message?" Eleanor asked, already grabbing her coat and heading for the door. Daniels hesitated before answering. "It was written on the wall, in blood." He paused, his voice dropping to a whisper. "It said, She knows. Eleanor froze in place, her mind racing. The Watcher, or whatever force was behind these deaths, wasn't just targeting random victims anymore. It was coming for her. When she arrived at the scene, the air was thick with tension. Police officers milled about nervously, their usual bravado replaced by unease. The body, a middle-aged man in a business suit, lay crumpled on the pavement, his face frozen in an expression of terror that Eleanor recognized all too well. But it was the message scrawled on the brick wall above him that held everyone's attention. She knows. Eleanor stared at the words, her pulse pounding in her ears. This wasn't just a warning, it was a challenge. Detective Hart, a voice called from behind her. She turned to see Dr. Margaret Voss approaching, her face pale but determined. "I came as soon as I heard," Voss said quietly. "This isn't over, is it?" Eleanor shook her head. "No," she admitted. "And I don't think it ever will be." Voss glanced at the message on the wall before turning back to Eleanor. "You've been marked," she said bluntly. "What does that mean?" Daniels asked sharply. "It means she's connected to whatever this is now," Voss explained. "The Watcher, or whatever force it serves, has taken notice of her." Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine but forced herself to stay focused. "How do we stop it?" she asked. Voss hesitated before answering. "You can't stop it completely," she said finally, "but you might be able to weaken its hold, to push it back long enough to buy yourself some time." "How?" Daniels demanded. "There's another ritual," Voss said reluctantly, "but it's dangerous, and it requires a sacrifice." Eleanor's heart sank at those words. She had already risked so much, her career, her sanity, but now it seemed that even greater sacrifices would be required. As they stood there in the shadow of yet another tragedy, Eleanor realized that this wasn't just about solving Langston's mystery anymore. It was about survival. The Watcher wasn't just hunting random victims. It was hunting her. And unless she found a way to fight back, it wouldn't stop until it claimed everything she held dear. That night, as Eleanor sat alone in her apartment with Langston's journal spread out before her and Dr. Voss's warnings echoing in her mind, she made a decision. She would confront whatever force had marked her, no matter what it took or what price she had to pay. Because if there was one thing Eleanor Hart refused to do, it was run. The city seemed to hold its breath as Eleanor prepared for what she knew would be her final confrontation. The Watcher, or whatever malevolent force had marked her, was growing bolder, its influence spreading like a shadow over Boston. The deaths were no longer isolated incidents. They were warnings, signs of something larger at play. And now, with the cryptic message scrawled in blood, the entity had made its intentions clear. Eleanor gathered everything she had: Langston's journal, Dr. Voss's research, and the fragmented obsidian shards they had recovered from the ruins. Each piece felt like a puzzle she was still struggling to assemble, but time was no longer on her side. The Watcher was coming for her, and if she didn't act soon, it wouldn't stop until it consumed everything. Dr. Voss met Eleanor and Daniels in a secluded warehouse on the outskirts of the city, a place chosen for its isolation and its lack of prying eyes. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of dust and oil, the dim light casting long shadows across the concrete floor. Voss had drawn an intricate ritual circle in chalk, its symbols matching those from Langston's journal. Candles flickered at each point of the circle, their flames dancing as though alive. "This is it," Voss said quietly, her voice steady despite the tension in the room. "If we can complete this ritual, we might be able to sever the connection between you and the Watcher." Eleanor nodded, her jaw set with determination. "What do I need to do?" Voss hesitated before answering. "You'll need to step into the circle and confront it directly," she said. "The Watcher will try to break you, to use your fears and memories against you. But you have to stay focused. If you falter, it will win." Daniel stepped forward, his face pale but resolute. "And what about us?" he asked. "You'll protect her," Voss replied simply. "The ritual will draw the Watcher here, but it won't come alone. It will bring manifestations, fragments of itself, to try and stop us." She looked at Daniels with a seriousness that made his stomach twist. "You have to keep them out of the circle at all costs." Eleanor glanced at Daniels, their eyes meeting in a moment of unspoken understanding. He gave her a small nod, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. "I've got your back," he said. As Eleanor stepped into the circle, a cold wind swept through the warehouse, extinguishing several candles and sending shivers down her spine. The air grew heavy, pressing against her chest like an invisible weight. She closed her eyes and began reciting the incantation from Langston's journal, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her insides. The first sign of the Watchers' arrival was a low hum that seemed to vibrate through every bone in their bodies. The shadows around them deepened, twisting and writhing as though alive, and then it appeared. The Watcher emerged from the darkness like a living nightmare, its glowing eyes burning with an intensity that made Eleanor's breath catch in her throat. It towered over her, its elongated limbs bending in impossible ways. As it stepped closer to the circle, Eleanor forced herself to keep speaking, her voice rising above the growing cacophony of whispers that filled the air. Voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Eleanor," one whispered in a voice that sounded like her mother's. "Why didn't you save me?" Another hissed in Langston's voice. She clenched her fists, refusing to let the voices distract her. This was exactly what Voss had warned about. The Watcher was trying to break her resolve. Outside the circle, Daniels and Voss fought to keep the manifestations at bay. Shadowy figures that clawed their way out of the darkness with glowing eyes and twisted forms. Daniels fired his weapon repeatedly, but bullets seemed to have little effect on them. "Voss!" he shouted over the chaos. "What do we do?" Voss grabbed a vial of salt from her bag and began hurling it at the creatures, each handful causing them to recoil with shrieks of pain. "Keep them away from Eleanor!" she yelled back. Inside the circle, Eleanor felt as though she were standing on the edge of an abyss. The Watcher loomed before her, its presence overwhelming as it reached out with one elongated hand toward her face. "You cannot win," it hissed in a voice that seemed to echo inside her mind. "You are nothing." But Eleanor didn't falter. "I am more than you think," she said through gritted teeth before shouting the final word of the incantation. The effect was immediate. The symbols around the circle flared with blinding light, forcing Daniels and Voss to shield their eyes as a deafening roar filled the warehouse. The Watcher thrashed violently within the barrier created by the circle, its form flickering as though being torn apart from within. Eleanor felt an immense pressure building around her, a force so powerful it threatened to crush her. But she held firm, and then silence. When she opened her eyes again, the warehouse was still. The shadows had receded, leaving only faint traces of their presence behind. The Watcher was gone, banished back to whatever realm it had come from. Daniels rushed into the circle and pulled Eleanor into a tight embrace, relief flooding through him as he realized she was alive. "It's over," he said quietly. But Eleanor wasn't so sure. As they left the warehouse under a sky streaked with dawn's first light, she couldn't shake one final thought. Langston had warned that some doors could never be fully closed, and now she understood why. The Watcher might be gone for now, but its mark remained, and Eleanor knew that someday it would return. Epilogue. The winter sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the city as Eleanor Hart walked through Boston Common. The park was quiet, its usual bustle subdued by the chill in the air. She pulled her coat tighter around her, her breath visible in the cold as she made her way to a bench overlooking the frozen pond. It had been 3 months since the night in the warehouse, 3 months since she had faced the Watcher and banished it back to whatever realm it had come from. But peace was an illusion. Eleanor sat down and stared at the pond, her reflection faint and distorted on the ice. Her fingers traced the edges of Langston's journal, now worn and dog-eared from countless readings. She hadn't been able to let it go, not yet. Every time she thought about putting it away, she felt a pull, as though the journal was a tether to something she couldn't escape. Life had returned to a semblance of normalcy after that night. Daniels had taken a leave of absence, retreating to his family's cabin in Maine to recover from what he called the case that broke reality. Dr. Voss had returned to her work at the university but kept in touch, sending Eleanor cryptic emails about new discoveries and ancient texts that hinted at similar phenomena around the world. And Eleanor? Eleanor had tried to move on. She returned to work, throwing herself into mundane cases, missing persons, robberies, even a high-profile fraud investigation. But none of it felt real anymore. Every shadow seemed darker than it should be. Every silence felt too loud. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, even when she was alone. The dreams were the worst part. Every night, she found herself back in Langston's basement, or standing in the ritual circle in the forest clearing. The Watcher's eyes burned into her soul, its voice whispering things she couldn't understand but instinctively feared. Sometimes she woke up gasping for air, her heart pounding as though she'd been running for her life. She hadn't told anyone, not Daniels, not Voss, about the mark. She could feel it now, an invisible weight pressing against her chest like a brand no one else could see. Langston's journal had warned her. If it has reached you, then you are already marked. She didn't know what that meant entirely, but she felt its truth in her bones. As Eleanor sat on the bench, lost in thought, a child's laughter broke through her reverie. A little boy chased a red balloon across the park, his mother calling after him with a smile. For a moment, Eleanor allowed herself to feel something close to hope. Maybe life could go on after all. But then she saw it. Out of the corner of her eye, just beyond where the boy was playing, a shadow moved unnaturally against the snow-covered ground. It wasn't cast by any tree or person. It moved independently, slithering across the white surface like ink spilled in water. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as she turned to look directly at it. But by then, it was gone. Her pulse quickened as she scanned the park for any sign of what she'd seen. Everything looked normal again. Children playing, couples walking hand in hand, joggers passing by with headphones in their ears. But Eleanor knew better. The Watcher wasn't gone, not entirely. Its mark on her wasn't just a reminder of what had happened. It was a connection to something far greater and far darker than she could comprehend. She stood abruptly, clutching Langston's journal tightly as she made her way out of the park. The shadows seemed to follow her as she walked through the city streets toward her apartment. That night, as she sat alone in her dimly lit living room with the journal open on her lap, Eleanor made a decision. She couldn't run from this. Not forever. Langston had tried to fight it alone and failed. But Eleanor wasn't Langston. She still had Daniels and Voss. She still had time to prepare. When the Watcher returned, she would be ready. For now, though, all she could do was wait and watch. As midnight struck and silence enveloped the city once more, Eleanor leaned back in her chair and stared out into the darkness beyond her window. Somewhere out there, it was waiting too. And this time, it wouldn't come alone.